Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of SciChat. Of course, SciChat is a two-part deal. The first part is what you're listening to right now. It is a weekly recorded webinar where we talk about some data about a specific topic in online marketing. All right. And we do it with data, so it is, of course, scientific. We use scientific method. We use exploration and experimentation and real data and real facts. That's why we call it SciChat. Now, the chat part, of course, comes from the other half of SciChat, which is a Facebook group of more than 1,000 scientifically minded marketers. That is, marketers who are interested in applying things like the scientific method to online marketing and making their jobs better. Right, and making themselves better at their jobs and making their efforts generate more business, more bottom line for their business. Right now, this week is going to be a little different than normal because, of course, it is President's Day here in the U.S. And not every company takes President's Day off, but HubSpot is one of the companies that does take President's Day off. Now, I record this ahead of time, so it's not exactly Monday and President's Day right now, but let's just pretend it is because that's when you're going to be listening to this. The HubSpot offices are, in fact, closed. So what we're going to do this week, I'm going to try and experiment with a shorter format. So basically, I'm going to make one point, and then we'll record. I'm recording the video with one point. I'll post it up to Facebook, and I want to hear your feedback. I want to hear, do you prefer the shorter videos with a single point or a couple of points in them, or do you prefer the longer 30-minute style videos that we had been doing? Okay, because again, as scientifically grounded marketers, one thing we need to always be doing is testing and changing our format and finding out what works best for everybody. So with that said, happy President's Day, everybody, and let's jump into what this week's topic is. And so for this week, we're going to talk about writing. Okay. Now, as marketing folks, as marketers, we are communications professionals. One of the core tenets or core responsibilities as marketing people is to be able to communicate with an audience, is to be able to persuade an audience, to take an idea, to take a set of values, to take a call to action and present it to our audience in such a way that it resonates with them. And the core tactic, the core tool we have in our toolbox to do that with, of course, is writing. Now, the actual written word forms of online marketing are numerous and easy to think of. Email marketing, most kinds of social media marketing, etc. Even though when we talk about video content, there is some amount of writing and editing and authorship and scripting that comes into play there. And then when we're talking about visual content, a lot of times visual content, stuff like infographics and memes, do have some micro copy. And that's really the key when it comes to the web, is that a lot of things are microcopy, under 140 characters or a couple hundred characters. Some things are a little bit longer, blog posts can be a little bit longer, emails can be a little bit longer. But generally speaking, we're not talking about writing huge tomes of text. Typically, the longest we're ever going to get in a sort of online marketing context is maybe an ebook. Most ebooks you're looking at 20, 30, 40, 50 pages maybe at most. And that's a pretty rare thing when you write in such a long piece of content. So it is key to remember that we're writing typically small structures, small bits of content. And when you're writing small bits of content, every word you choose has to be chosen well, which means that your craft of writing needs to be tight. You need to know how to write. You don't need to be Hemingway, but you do need to be able to approach the craft of writing with the amount of respect that it deserves. And in fact, I do find it kind of silly that a lot of times as marketers, we will spend time in professional development learning how to use some new Twitter type platforms, some new social media type platforms, some new Twitter functions, new Facebook ad format or whatever. But very rarely do we sit down and think about how can I improve my writing abilities. And it's silly because that is one of the most important tools we have in our toolbox. If we were woodworkers, would we never sharpen our chisels? Would we never, oil our wrenches? Or I don't exactly know, what those tools are. But you really need to maintain that because it is a important element of your marketing capabilities. And in doing that myself, I've read a lot of books on writing. One of the best ones, perhaps the best one I've come across, a book called Elements of Style. Now, Elements of Style is the current version that we know as Elements of Style is actually a revised edition of an earlier book. The earliest version of it was written by a professor named William Strunk Jr., as you can see from this image, who wrote a book, a very, very, very short book, and was basically about how to for sort of simple classic American literary style. E.B. White, the author of Charlotte's Web, took this gentleman's class and then years later decided to revise his book, Elements of Style, added essentially a whole second half to the book. But the book is still very, very short. I forget the total number of pages, but it is super short. And in fact, if your office has President's Day off, I urge you to either run down to your bookstore, get a digital copy, whatever you need to do, and read this book. It'll take like maybe an hour at most, but it will do wonders for your writing abilities. And that is true if you've read it before and if you haven't. If you haven't, you need to read it. And if you have read it before and you haven't read it recently, you also need to read it. I read it every once in a while. So what you're seeing here, actually, I have a small old book collection. One of my most favorite parts of that old book collection is a gift that was given to me by my wife, Allison Zarella, which is a first edition copy of Elements of Style. And of course, it's the first edition of the revised version with E.B. White's part in it as well. But that is one of my most prized possessions in my old book collection. And so what's interesting about the lessons that you learn in this book is that while they are old, right, the book isn't new, they are just as applicable today as they ever have been. So in fact, when you look at content written on the web, so in this study, I looked at hundreds of thousands of articles published to like news sites and blogs, things like that. And I looked at the title of those articles. Okay. And then I looked at the number of times those articles were shared on Facebook. And I ran the titles through what's called the part of speech tagger. That is a piece of software that categorizes words into parts of speech. In this case, we're looking at nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs. What you find is that the nouns and verbs are in the orange. That means articles that were based, where the titles were based most heavily on nouns and verbs, tended to do better as far as Facebook sharing goes than articles that contained a lot of adjectives and adverbs in their titles. So I want you to picture for a second what a title looks like when it is full of adjectives and adverbs. It's flowery, it's ornate, it's chintzy, right? It's elaborate. Now think about a sentence, a structure, an interesting title that uses only nouns and verbs. It's terse, it's efficient, it's solid, it's meaningful. When you are writing with nouns and verbs, you're writing well. Typically your sentences are going to be shorter. Often your words are going to be shorter too, because you don't have all that like "ly" kind of suffixing that goes on with adjectives and adverbs. When you're writing with a lot of adjectives and adverbs, if you find yourself pulling for adjectives and adverbs out of like the thesaurus constantly, you really need to stop and think and say, what am I trying to say? And is there a noun or is there a verb that I can use in place of just adjective and adverb or adverb? Right? Because if you're reaching for adjectives and adverbs, that's a sign that something is going wrong with the way you're writing. Okay, so that's what the data says. But then when we dig into the book, Elements of Style, we find this. On page 57, at least in my version, page 57, they teach us exactly that. Now, one of my pet peeves as a presenter is when presenters read all the text that's on a slide. And it's a pet peeve because you can read faster than I can speak, even though I know I speak very, very fast. So I'm going to give you a couple of seconds here just to read through this paragraph. I'm not going to be totally quiet because dead silence is a little bit weird, but I'm not going to say anything super important. So once you've read through that, let me paraphrase it a little bit for you. Basically, they're saying that you need to write with nouns and verbs. Adjectives and adverbs are crutches, and they're bad crutches at that. Right? It is nouns and verbs that are the foundation, the vigor, the core drivers of sentences and of text. And so if you find yourself using adjectives and adverbs, really go back to the basics and start to understand why. What am I doing wrong that I find myself grasping at these literary straws? And then take it a step further. We go back to that Facebook data set and we look at a measure called readability. Now what readability is, it's essentially a measure of the complexity of language. So it's a number. You run an algorithm. Flesh Kincaid is one of the most common ones. You can find it in Microsoft Word, but basically it's an algorithm that you run it. You hand it a piece of language, and it tells you how complex the language is. And what it does is it spits out a grade level, and that grade level indicates the amount of schooling, amount of education you should have had to have completed to be able to understand the content you've passed to this algorithm. Meaning, if you give a paragraph to this algorithm, the algorithm gives you a really high number, the paragraph is very, very complex. Generally, it's measuring stuff like word length and syllables, or word length and letters, grammatical structures, length of sentences, stuff like that. So it's pretty simple, but it's actually really, really good. And so what you find is that as readability decreases, like as the grade level increases, the complexity increases, the amount of times that articles are shared on Facebook decreases. So it is simpler language that gets shared more often, language with nouns and verbs, and language that is simple. So when I say write plainly and simply for social media, I'm not saying write dumb. I'm saying write well. Because as we've learned from books like Strunk and White, when you pick it up, and another great book is called On Writing Well, it is good writing that is simple and plain and easy to understand and uses nouns and verbs and the active voice and things like that. So give that a try. Look over some of the stuff that you're writing on a day-to-day basis. See how you can clean it up. See how you can make it more simple. See how you can really focus on those well-chosen nouns and verbs. How you can make it sound like something a fourth grader could read versus a graduate student, and see if that works for you. And then let me know in the Facebook group if you prefer this format, like the shorter format, or if you prefer the longer format, and we will go back to whichever format you guys like next week. And I look forward to, of course,